The millionaire found a note in the maid's purse and discovered a devastating secret. You're about to discover an incredible story that will completely change how you think about trust, family, and that one small piece of paper can unravel decades of carefully constructed lies. If you're ready for a journey that will keep you on the edge of your seat and challenge everything you think you know about loyalty and deception, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. Now, let's dive into this amazing tale that begins in the opulent halls of a Manhattan mansion, where a moment of unexpected discovery is about to shatter a family's world forever. Chapter 1. The Perfect Life, Built on Hidden Truths. The Thornfield Mansion stood like a fortress of wealth and privilege on Fifth Avenue, its limestone facade concealing secrets that would have shocked New York's elite society. Inside the 12,000-square-foot residence, pharmaceutical mogul Jonathan Thornfield, 52, lived what appeared to be the perfect American success story, a self-made billionaire who had built Thornfield Pharmaceuticals into one of the world's most profitable drug companies while maintaining an image of family values and corporate responsibility. Jonathan's empire was built on what he proudly called ethical pharmaceuticals, medications that helped millions of people while generating enormous profits through legitimate research and development. His public persona as a devoted family man and charitable philanthropist had earned him recognition as one of America's most admired business leaders, someone who proved that success and moral integrity could coexist in the modern corporate world. The mansion's elegant rooms reflected Jonathan's carefully cultivated image, family photographs with his beloved wife Margaret and their 2 teenage children, awards for humanitarian service and expensive art that spoke to refined cultural sensibilities. Every detail of the Thornfield household suggested a life of purpose, achievement, and genuine happiness, built on solid foundations of hard work and ethical business practices. At the center of this perfect world was Carmen Rodriguez, 47, who had worked as the Thornfield family's live-in housekeeper for 8 years. Carmen managed every aspect of the household's daily operations with the efficiency and discretion that wealthy families demanded from their domestic staff. She maintained their schedules, organized their social events, and ensured that the mansion operated smoothly while the family focused on their professional and social obligations. 2. Jonathan and Margaret. Carmen was the ideal employee, reliable, invisible when appropriate, and completely trustworthy with the intimate details of their family life. She had access to every room in the mansion, handled their personal correspondence, and maintained their most private spaces, with the professional discretion that had made her invaluable to the Thornfield household. What the Thornfield family didn't know was that Carmen Rodriguez harbored a secret that would destroy their perfect world if it were ever revealed. For 8 years, she had been documenting evidence of crimes that reached into the highest levels of government and corporate America, crimes that involved Jonathan Thornfield and would expose him as one of the most dangerous criminals in pharmaceutical history. Carmen had not sought this position by accident. She was Carmen Rodriguez Santos, a former investigative journalist whose sister Maria had died from a medication that Thornfield Pharmaceuticals had known was dangerous, but had continued marketing to maximize profits. Carmen had spent 3 years infiltrating the Thornfield household to gather evidence that would bring justice for her sister and thousands of other victims of corporate greed, disguised as medical innovation. The truth about Thornfield Pharmaceuticals was far more sinister than anyone outside the company's inner circle could have imagined. Jonathan had built his fortune by bribing federal regulators to approve dangerous medications, suppressing safety data that revealed deadly side effects, and manipulating clinical trials to hide evidence that would have prevented FDA approval of drugs that killed more people than they helped. For 8 years, Carmen had been photographing documents, recording conversations, and collecting evidence that revealed the full scope of Jonathan's criminal enterprise. Her sister Maria had been just one of over 12,000 people who had died from medications that Thornfield Pharmaceuticals knew were lethal but continued selling because the profits exceeded the legal settlements they paid to victims' families. This particular morning, as autumn sunlight streamed through the mansion's tall windows, Jonathan was preparing for what he expected to be a routine day of managing his corporate empire and maintaining the public image that had made him one of America's most respected business leaders. He had no idea that this ordinary Tuesday would become the day when 8 years of careful investigation would finally expose the truth about his crimes. Carmen was in the mansion's main library, carefully dusting the expensive first editions and family heirlooms that decorated Jonathan's private study. As she worked, she reviewed the final pieces of evidence she needed to complete her investigation, documents that would prove Jonathan's personal involvement in decisions that had resulted in thousands of deaths. The irony was not lost on Carmen that she was surrounded by books about ethics, leadership, and social responsibility, while documenting evidence of some of the most callous disregard for human life in corporate history. Jonathan's study was filled with volumes about moral philosophy and business ethics, creating a facade of intellectual sophistication that masked the calculated cruelty of his actual business practices. As Carmen finished her work in the library, she heard Jonathan's voice in the hallway, speaking with his assistant about scheduling a meeting with FDA officials who were reviewing another Thornfield medication for approval. The casual tone of their conversation about regulatory meetings that Carmen knew involved substantial bribes reminded her of why she had dedicated 8 years of her life to exposing Jonathan's crimes. "Carmen," Jonathan called out as he entered the library, "I'll be working from home this morning, so please ensure I'm not disturbed unless it's urgent." "Of course, Mr. Thornfield," Carmen replied with the deferential tone she had perfected over 8 years of maintaining her cover. "Will you need anything special prepared for your meetings?" "Just the usual refreshments," Jonathan said dismissively, his attention already focused on phone calls that would coordinate criminal activities worth millions of dollars, while Carmen remained invisible to his awareness. As Jonathan settled into his study to conduct business that involved bribing government officials and suppressing evidence of drug safety problems, Carmen continued her household duties while planning the final phase of her investigation. She had gathered enough evidence to destroy Jonathan's empire and send him to prison for life, but she needed to ensure that her revelations would reach law enforcement and the media before Jonathan could use his wealth and political connections to suppress the truth. What Carmen didn't anticipate was that a moment of carelessness would expose her secret investigation in the most dangerous way possible, putting her life at risk while testing whether 8 years of careful planning would be enough to bring justice for her sister and thousands of other victims. The note that would change everything was hidden in Carmen's purse, waiting to be discovered by the very man whose crimes it documented. And when Jonathan Thornfield found that piece of paper, it would trigger a confrontation that would determine whether truth and justice could triumph over wealth and corruption. The stage was set for a discovery that would shake the pharmaceutical industry to its core, and Carmen had no idea that her carefully guarded secret was about to be exposed in the most perilous way imaginable. If you're as intrigued as we are by Carmen's dangerous mission and as shocked by Jonathan's hidden crimes, make sure you've hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, because what happens when that note is discovered will leave you absolutely stunned. Chapter 2. The Discovery That Shattered Everything. The crisis that would expose Carmen's 8-year investigation began with a medical emergency that no one could have anticipated. Margaret Thornfield collapsed during her morning yoga session, experiencing severe chest pain that required immediate hospitalization. As paramedics worked to stabilize her condition, Jonathan found himself frantically searching for Margaret's medical information and emergency contact details. "Carmen!" Jonathan shouted as the ambulance arrived, his usual composure shattered by fear for his wife's life. "I need Margaret's medication list and her doctor's contact information immediately." Carmen rushed to help, pulling out her personal phone to access the detailed health records she maintained for all family members. In her haste to provide crucial medical information that could save Margaret's life, she grabbed the wrong purse, not her carefully organized work bag, but her personal purse that contained evidence of her investigation into Jonathan's criminal activities. "The medication list is in my phone," Carmen said, digging through her purse while paramedics prepared Margaret for transport, "and Dr. Harrison's emergency number is in my contacts." As Carmen searched frantically for her phone, papers and documents scattered from her purse onto the marble floor of the mansion's entryway, Jonathan, focused entirely on his wife's medical crisis, helped gather Carmen's belongings without paying attention to their contents, until, One particular document caught his eye and made his blood run cold. The paper that stopped Jonathan's world was a handwritten note in Carmen's careful script. FDA approval meeting. $2.3 million payment confirmed. Dr. Reynolds agreed to suppress safety data on Nurexin trials. 847 patient deaths attributed to cardiac complications. Jonathan personally approved continued marketing despite known fatality rate. Jonathan stared at the note with growing horror as its implications became clear. Carmen Rodriguez, the trusted housekeeper who had access to every aspect of his family's life, had been documenting his most carefully guarded criminal activities. The note referenced information that only someone with access to his most confidential business communications could have obtained. "Carmen," Jonathan said slowly, his voice carrying a deadly calm that masked explosive rage. "What is this?" Carmen looked up from her search and felt her heart stop as she saw Jonathan holding the note. That contained evidence of crimes that could send him to prison for life. 8 years of careful investigation and meticulous cover had been blown by a moment of crisis and carelessness. "Mr. Thornfield," Carmen replied, trying to maintain her composure while her mind raced through possibilities for salvaging the situation. "I don't know what you're referring to." Jonathan held up the note, his face white with fury and growing understanding of the massive betrayal that had been occurring under his own roof. "This note describes confidential business meetings and financial arrangements that no one outside my inner circle should know about. How do you have this information?" The paramedics were loading Margaret into the ambulance, shouting for Jonathan to accompany them to the hospital. But Jonathan's attention was now focused entirely on the devastating revelation that the woman he had trusted with his family's most intimate secrets had been spying on him for years. "Sir, we need to leave for the hospital immediately," the lead paramedic called out. "Your wife's condition is critical." Jonathan faced an impossible choice: accompany his wife to the hospital while leaving Carmen free to destroy evidence and contact law enforcement, or stay to confront the spy who had infiltrated his home while his wife potentially died without him present. "Carmen," Jonathan said with cold precision, "you're coming with me to the hospital. We're going to discuss this note and any other information you might have." Carmen realized that Jonathan suspected the full scope of her investigation and was ensuring she couldn't escape or contact authorities while he dealt with the family crisis. She was now trapped between completing her mission to expose his crimes and protecting herself from a man who had killed thousands of people and would not hesitate to eliminate one more threat to his empire. During the tense ride to Mount Sinai Hospital, Jonathan studied Carmen with new eyes, seeing past the facade of humble domesticity to recognize the intelligent, determined woman who had been documenting his criminal activities with professional precision. The note in his hand was too detailed and sophisticated to be casual observation. It represented systematic investigation by someone with training and purpose. "Carmen," Jonathan said quietly as they sat in the hospital waiting room, "I think we need to have a very honest conversation about who you really are and what you've been doing in my house for 8 years. Carmen knew that her cover was completely blown and that Jonathan's suspicions would lead him to discover the full extent of her investigation. But she also knew that her sister Maria and thousands of other victims deserved justice, and that running now would waste 8 years of dangerous work to expose one of the most deadly corporate criminals in American history. "Mr. Thornfield," Carmen replied with quiet dignity, "I think you're right. It's time for complete honesty about who we both really are." Jonathan felt a chill as Carmen's tone shifted from subservient employee to something far more confident and threatening. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean that I know exactly what Nurexin does to patients who take it. I know how much you've paid federal officials to approve dangerous medications, and I know that you've been responsible for more deaths than most serial killers." Carmen looked directly into Jonathan's eyes. "And I have 8 years of evidence to prove it." The silence between them was broken only by hospital sounds, announcements, medical equipment, and the controlled chaos of an emergency medical facility. Jonathan realized that he was sitting next to someone who possessed the power to destroy his empire, send him to prison for life, and expose crimes that would shock the world. "Who are you really?" Jonathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Carmen's answer would reveal the full scope of the investigation that had been conducted under his own roof. "My name is Carmen Rodriguez Santos, My sister Maria died from neurexin cardiac complications that you knew would kill her. I've spent 8 years gathering evidence to ensure that you face justice for what you've done to thousands of families like mine." As the truth of Carmen's identity and mission became clear, Jonathan understood that the perfect life he had built on criminal foundations was about to collapse. The loyal housekeeper, who had seemed so trustworthy, had actually been the most dangerous threat his empire had ever faced. The note in his hand was just the beginning of evidence that would expose pharmaceutical crimes on a scale that would shock the world and destroy everyone involved in Thornfield Pharmaceuticals' deadly conspiracy. Chapter 3. When Truth Confronts Power. The confrontation in Mount Sinai Hospital's waiting room continued for 3 hours while Margaret Thornfield underwent emergency cardiac surgery. During that time, Carmen Rodriguez Santos and Jonathan Thornfield engaged in the most consequential conversation of both their lives, a battle between truth and corruption that would determine whether justice could triumph over wealth and power. "Maria Rodriguez Santos," Jonathan repeated slowly, his memory searching through thousands of patient names from clinical trials and adverse event reports. "Your sister was one of the neuraxin fatalities in the Phase 3 trials." Carmen's eyes filled with tears as she spoke about the person whose death had driven her 8-year mission. Maria was 28 years old, a teacher with 2 young children. She volunteered for your clinical trial because she wanted to help other people suffering from depression. You killed her for profit. Jonathan's face showed no remorse as he processed this information with the cold calculation that had built his criminal empire. "Carmen, you need to understand something about pharmaceutical development. There are always risks, and sometimes people die during clinical trials. That's the unfortunate reality of medical research. Don't you dare try to justify what you did," Carmen replied with controlled fury. "I have recordings of your meetings where you discussed suppressing safety data that showed neuraxin caused fatal cardiac complications in 12% of patients. You knew it would kill people, and you chose to pursue FDA approval anyway." The accusation hit Jonathan like a physical blow because Carmen's information was devastatingly accurate. He had indeed made the calculated decision to suppress safety data and bribe FDA officials to approve neuraxin, despite knowing it would result in thousands of deaths. The profits from the medication, over $800 million annually, had made the legal settlements for wrongful death suits seem like acceptable business expenses. "Carmen, even if you have some evidence of business discussions, you can't possibly understand the complexities of pharmaceutical regulation and risk assessment," Jonathan said, trying to regain control of the situation through intimidation and condescension. Carmen pulled out her phone and began playing an audio recording that made Jonathan's face go white with shock and fear. "The FDA Safety Committee will approve neuraxin if we can ensure their concerns about cardiac complications don't appear in the final clinical trial report. Dr. Reynolds has agreed to exclude the fatality data for $2.3 million, and Commissioner Walsh will fast-track approval for an additional $1.8 million. Jonathan's own voice, recorded during a meeting in his study while Carmen cleaned nearby, provided unambiguous evidence of bribery, data suppression, and conspiracy to market medications that he knew would kill patients. The recording was devastating proof of crimes that would result in life imprisonment and the complete destruction of his corporate empire. "How did you record that meeting?" Jonathan demanded, his voice shaking with rage and fear. "The same way I recorded hundreds of other meetings over the past 8 years, Carmen replied calmly. "You never noticed the domestic staff because we were invisible to you. But invisible doesn't mean deaf or powerless." Carmen continued playing recordings that documented Jonathan's involvement in approving dangerous medications, bribing government officials, and suppressing safety data that would have saved thousands of lives. Each recording was more damning than the last, revealing a pattern of criminal behavior that spanned decades and involved dozens of government officials and corporate executives. "I have over 200 hours of recordings, 5,000 photographed documents, and financial records that trace every bribe payment and cover-up that Thornfield Pharmaceuticals has conducted since I started working in your house," Carmen explained. "Your entire criminal enterprise is documented with evidence that will convict everyone involved." Jonathan realized that Carmen had assembled the most comprehensive case against pharmaceutical corruption in legal history. Her position as household staff had given her access to information that law enforcement and journalists could never have obtained through traditional investigation. "What do you want?" Jonathan asked, understanding that Carmen held his entire future in her hands. "I want justice for Maria and the thousands of other people you've killed," Carmen replied without hesitation. "I want Thornfield. Pharmaceuticals shut down. I want every dangerous medication you've approved removed from the market, and I want you and your co-conspirators to spend the rest of your lives in prison." Jonathan felt desperation rising as he contemplated the destruction of everything he had built through decades of careful crime and corruption. "Carmen, you need to understand that powerful people are involved in these arrangements. If you expose this information, you'll be putting yourself in danger from people who won't hesitate to eliminate threats." "Mr. Thornfield," Carmen said with quiet courage, "I've been in danger every day for 8 years. The people you've bribed and corrupted are the same people who should be protecting public safety. Someone has to hold you accountable, even if it costs me everything." At that moment, a doctor appeared in the waiting room with news about Margaret's condition. "Mr. Thornfield, your wife is stable, and the surgery was successful. She's experienced a severe cardiac event, but we expect her to make a full recovery with proper treatment." Jonathan felt relief about Margaret's survival, but he also realized that Carmen's investigation had revealed something that made his blood run cold. Margaret's cardiac event bore striking similarity to the side effects that had killed Neuraxin patients, and she had been taking an experimental Thornfield medication for anxiety that he had never told her was still undergoing safety testing. "Carmen," Jonathan said. "Slowly, what kind of medications has Margaret been taking recently?" Carmen's expression grew grave as she understood the implications of Jonathan's question. "Dr. Harrison prescribed Anxiplex for her anxiety 6 months ago. You told him it was a safe, FDA-approved medication." Jonathan felt the full weight of his crimes crashing down as he realized that his pursuit of profit had potentially endangered his own wife's life. Anxiplex was another Thornfield medication that had shown cardiac complications during testing, but Jonathan had pushed it to market through the same bribery and data suppression techniques he had used with Neuraxin. "Mr. Thornfield," Carmen said with devastating clarity, "I think you need to consider the possibility that your crimes may have nearly killed the person you love most." The irony was perfect and terrible. Jonathan Thornfield, who had killed thousands of patients for profit, had almost lost his own wife to the same dangerous medications he had knowingly approved despite their deadly side effects. As this realization sank in, Jonathan understood that Carmen's 8-year investigation had not just exposed his crimes, it had revealed how corporate corruption could destroy even the families of those who perpetrated it. Chapter 4. Justice for the Invisible Victims. 6 months after Carmen Rodriguez Santos had confronted Jonathan Thornfield in that hospital waiting room, the pharmaceutical industry was reeling from the largest criminal prosecution in medical history. The evidence that Carmen had gathered during her 8-year undercover investigation had led to federal charges against 47 individuals, including Jonathan, 12 FDA officials, and executives from 6 different pharmaceutical companies involved in the conspiracy. Carmen stood before a packed congressional hearing room, delivering testimony that had already resulted in the recall of 15 dangerous medications and the complete restructuring of FDA approval processes. Her transformation from invisible household employee to the most important whistleblower in pharmaceutical history had inspired legislation that would protect millions of patients from corporate greed disguised as medical innovation. "Honorable members of Congress," Carmen testified, "what I discovered during my investigation was not just individual corruption, but systematic failure of the institutions designed to protect public health. When profit becomes more important than patient safety, the entire medical system becomes a threat to the people it's supposed to serve." The hearing room was filled with family members of patients who had died from medications that Thornfield Pharmaceuticals and other companies had known were dangerous. Carmen's evidence had provided them with the proof they needed to hold corporate executives accountable for deaths that had previously been dismissed as unavoidable medical complications. Senator Patricia Martinez, chair of the Health Committee, reviewed Carmen's documentation with obvious amazement. "Ms. Rodriguez Santos, your investigation has revealed pharmaceutical crimes that resulted in over 50,000 patient deaths. How did regulatory agencies fail to detect this conspiracy for so many years? Carmen's answer revealed the sophisticated nature of the corruption she had exposed. Senator, the conspiracy succeeded because it involved the very people who were supposed to detect it. FDA officials were receiving millions of dollars to approve dangerous medications. Clinical trial data was being falsified by the researchers conducting the studies, and safety monitoring was being performed by the same companies that profited from hiding problems. The scope of the conspiracy had shocked even veteran prosecutors. Jonathan Thornfield's network had corrupted nearly every level of pharmaceutical regulation, creating a system where dangerous medications were approved through bribery while safety data was suppressed, through financial incentives and professional intimidation. Ms. Rodriguez-Santos, said Representative David Chen, what gave you the courage to spend 8 years in such a dangerous undercover investigation? Carmen's voice carried the quiet strength of someone who had found meaning in justice. My sister Maria died because she trusted that the medical system would protect her. When I learned that her death was caused by corporate greed rather than medical necessity, I knew that someone had to gather evidence that could prevent other families from suffering the same loss. During the hearing's afternoon session, Carmen presented evidence that had led to criminal convictions and massive financial penalties that exceeded $12 billion. Jonathan Thornfield had been sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole, while Thornfield Pharmaceuticals had been dissolved and its assets distributed to victims' families and patient safety organizations. The most important result of this investigation, Carmen explained to the Congressional Committee, is not the punishment of those who committed crimes, but the protection of future patients through reformed oversight and genuine safety monitoring. Carmen's work had led to the creation of the Patient Safety Protection Act, legislation that required independent safety monitoring for all pharmaceutical trials, established whistleblower protections for healthcare workers, and created criminal penalties for executives who suppressed safety data. The law had been named the Maria Rodriguez-Santos Act in honor of Carmen's sister and the thousands of other victims whose deaths had been preventable. Dr. Elena Morrison, the FDA's new Director of Safety Oversight, testified about the reforms that Carmen's investigation had inspired. Ms. Rodriguez-Santos has fundamentally changed how we approach pharmaceutical safety. Her evidence showed us that our previous systems were vulnerable to corruption and manipulation, and we've implemented new protocols that make such conspiracies impossible. The new safety systems included independent monitoring by researchers with no financial connections to pharmaceutical companies, public disclosure of all clinical trial data, and criminal background checks for officials involved in drug approval processes. Most importantly, the reforms had created multiple pathways for healthcare workers to report safety concerns without fear of retaliation or professional destruction. After the congressional hearing, Carmen was approached by Maria Santos, a young medical student whose mother had died from one of the medications that Carmen's investigation had removed from the market. Ms. Rodriguez-Santos, Maria said with tears in her eyes, my mother would still be alive if people like you had been protecting patients when she got sick. Thank you for making sure that other families won't lose their loved ones to corporate greed. Carmen hugged Maria warmly, understanding that her 8 years of dangerous investigation had been worthwhile if it prevented even one unnecessary death. Your mother's memory, like my sister's, will live on in the protections we've created for future patients. That evening, Carmen visited her sister's grave for the first time since beginning her undercover investigation. She placed fresh flowers on Maria's headstone and spoke quietly about the justice that had finally been achieved. Maria, it took 8 years, but we did it, Carmen said softly. The people who killed you are in prison. The medications that would have killed others have been removed from the market, and new laws will protect patients from the kind of corruption that cost you your life. Carmen had been offered numerous job opportunities, including positions with law enforcement agencies and patient advocacy organizations who wanted to utilize her investigative skills and pharmaceutical knowledge. But she had decided to establish the Maria Rodriguez-Santos Foundation, an organization dedicated to identifying and exposing healthcare corruption while supporting families affected by pharmaceutical crimes. The most important lesson from this investigation, Carmen reflected, as she stood beside her sister's grave, is that invisible people are often the ones who see truth most clearly. When you're overlooked and underestimated, you can observe and document realities that powerful people prefer to keep hidden. Carmen's foundation would train other investigators to infiltrate corrupt organizations and gather evidence that traditional law enforcement couldn't obtain. Her method of using domestic employment to access confidential information had proven so effective that it was being studied by federal agencies as a new approach to investigating white-collar crime. Most importantly, Carmen had proven that justice could triumph over wealth and power when someone was willing to sacrifice everything to protect others. Her note, the piece of paper that had accidentally exposed her investigation, had led to the most significant pharmaceutical safety reforms in American history. The invisible maid had become the most visible advocate for patient safety in the world, demonstrating that courage and determination could defeat even the most sophisticated criminal conspiracies when motivated by love and justice. The story of Carmen Rodriguez Santos and Jonathan Thornfield reminds us that justice sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources, and that the people we overlook or dismiss may be the ones with the power to expose the truth and protect the innocent. Carmen's incredible 8-year investigation shows us that love for family and commitment to justice can overcome even the most powerful criminal conspiracies. Her accidentally discovered note didn't just expose pharmaceutical crimes, it led to reforms that will save countless lives for generations to come. If this story opened your eyes to the importance of protecting whistleblowers and holding powerful institutions accountable, please like this video to help us share this crucial message about courage, justice, and fighting for what's right. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories about ordinary people who accomplish extraordinary things. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss content that could inspire you to stand up for truth and justice. Have you ever discovered something that changed everything you thought you knew about a situation? Share your story in the comments below, and remember, sometimes the smallest piece of evidence can bring down the largest conspiracy, and the most invisible people can create the most visible change.